experience in this space, seeing companies that have projects and companies at this stage of formation, just telling their stories as well. So I'm going to very, very quickly just say names and titles, but I'm going to let you all introduce yourself. And we're also going to switch out about halfway through. We'll take a 5-minute break, and we're gonna switch out Tom because we don't need to hear from him that long. I'm going to switch in JR. So first and wonderfully we have Leah Damasio. She's the COO of Hummingbird Biosciences. Sits right next door at J Labs, and they just raised $150 million round, $30 million round, $125 million round. Sorry, after 100, I stopped paying attention. This last year, but she's worked everything from inception to that. Tom Luby is our director of innovation. Obviously, had and formerly worked with a number of biotechs up in Boston, was also the head of J Labs, and he has seen something of a little bit of everything and lived it as well. And Dan Watkins is a partner at Mercury Fund, also the CEO of Mercury Data Science. I worked with Dan on Courier. So if all the mistakes were probably my fault, and the reasons we were successful was because of Dan. And he's worked with a ton of, again, early stage projects and startups, and continues to be really active. So I'm gonna let you guys expand on that as you would like, but stop talking. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, I'm currently the Chief Operating Officer at Hummingbird Bioscience, which is a company that develops antibody therapeutics primarily focused in oncology. The company was based out of Singapore, but received a CPRIT relocation grant in 2019, and that's kind of the reason for the presence here. So my responsibilities there are really kind of overseeing the clinical development aspects of the organization, and pretty much anything else that needs to get done. But prior to that, I've spent about the past, I have to count, I guess, 13, 14 years in the biotech industry, primarily working in the preclinical and clinical development space. I've been in Houston since 2013, and that's really the period of time that's been devoted to working with startups, because that's what's here. And I spent a good chunk of that time working for another CPRIT relocation awardee, ESSA Pharma. So I've kind of started there at the stage where the project was just coming out of an academic lab, and took it from that stage through IND and into the clinic, and also was the second hire there and helped kind of build out the team. After that, I did found a company of my own, Maya Biotechnology. So have kind of been in your shoes thinking about what does that mean, and what is the first step. And then between Maya and Hummingbird, I worked with Sarah as an EIR here with the TNC Act program. So happy to be here today. And I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thank you, Leah. Tom Luby. So I grew up in the Boston biotech scene, so did my graduate work at Tufts University, and was a postdoc for about 6 months, and I was like, this is like being a graduate student all over again. So I jumped into an established biotech, which it was still, I was like the 40th employee focused on immunotherapeutics in allergy, and actually rode that. The lead product was preclinical, got into the clinic. That company went public, so I had the experience of having these like stock options that turned into actual cash. I said that was cool, so let's do that again. So then left that company, jumped into a very early stage biotech. Again, preclinical, helped with some of the fundraising, managed a lot of the preclinical work, got that into the clinic, and then we got acquired by a publicly traded biotech. So I went through an M&A. And worked in a publicly traded biotech for 4 years before it got acquired as well by a large Japanese pharmaceutical company. So kind of went from small biotech to mid-sized publicly traded biotech to a Japanese company. It's worked for a year in that company, so I got some international pharma experience. started a company with a really good friend and colleague of mine, nights and weekends, getting the company off the ground. We did get some seed funding, but never any institutional funding, and then both had to pay our mortgages, so went our separate way. And then right before I came here, I had taken a job at Shire doing early stage investing, corporate venture capital investing in the rare disease space. Was doing that for a few years, and then got recruited over to J&J to do the same, but in neuro and immunology. I'm an immunologist by training, and then was working at J&J, got transferred down here to run J-Labs. That's how I got to Houston, and then got recruited over to TMC to be part of the TMC innovation team. So all this program, a bunch of other programs, our venture fund, lots of things focused on helping startups to be successful here in Houston. So really happy to be here.
So I've been Mercury Fund. We started about 15 years ago. A substantial portion of what I've done is company creation or working on really early seed stage deals that have just been created. And I think I need to do the math, but I would guess that 30 or 40% of them have been out of universities where we found scientists and sort of helped create the company. Sometimes that went fast, and most of the times it went slower than we thought, but kind of built a little bit of a playbook on how we like to think about that very early stages. And one of those examples, the one that Sarah did such a great job on, was Courier, where we had kind of an early milestone-based exit that I think ultimately was a really big win for our fund, given that we didn't have to take a lot of dilution, and we got kind of a nice outcome, but the jury's out on whether we'll be totally successful on that one. We've done oncolytic viruses, medical devices out of universities, and with kinase inhibitor, immunology technologies. So a lot of what we do in the early stage, or what I've done, is sort of figure out what the business strategy, combination of business strategy, IP strategy, and then the early sort of how do you build the technical story around it so you can get to the next level. And that's, I guess, what we're here.
You need the mic. Sorry.
Sure. So I think to start this off, I think we're going to start off with, actually I want to start off with all three of you, because I think you all have different stories to talk about this, which is you all have been involved in the very, very beginning of a company, right? And taking something that's a scientific project and trying to clean it up for fundraising. And so when you're going through that process, what are the boxes you like to check? What are some mistakes you make? 'Cause I think the mistakes are sometimes more illustrative than, yeah, it worked out, because that's really difficult to describe. Of course it worked. Sometimes you don't know why it worked. So what are the mistakes you've made in trying to take a fundamentally scientific story and attract that first bit of money and interest?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of different ways to answer that question, I guess. One of the mistakes I feel like was made with our company was finding the right audience for your pitch. So knowing that not everyone is going to understand the biotech industry, and just because they're a ready and willing investor doesn't mean that they're a good investor that you want on your side. I think it's a really complex industry, and the business model is very different from that of health tech or med device or pretty much any other startup industry, where you're going to be pretty much a capital sink for a really long time. You're a very risky investment. And I think, what Dan was describing is usually the exception to the rule, that you get a nice early exit with little dilution. For the most part, dilution is going to happen and just should be accepted. So I think kind of just being thoughtful about the money that you're taking in is one aspect that's really important. I think there's a number of different avenues that could be spoken to here in terms of the data package, but I'll let the others kind of speak to this as well before hogging the mic for too long.
Feel free to hog away. You know, I think that fundamentally, when I think about the startup that we tried to get off the ground and we didn't, I reflect on what Dan said. It took longer than we thought. You know, we just had a bullish attitude about our ability to get it off the ground and get started and get funding. And you know, for a number of reasons, it just took a long time. And you know, time's not your friend, especially, you know, at that point, I was working full-time and trying to do this on nights and weekends. I had, you know, a family, kids, mortgage, and you know, you just start to feel the pressure of, you know, all the effort and not getting it to get to where you need it to be so you could leave the full-time job and join this job full-time and, you know, get back to actually spending time with your family. So that's really, at the end of the day, what exhausted the ability to do this. I couldn't continue the pace that I was trying to keep up. And I look back on it, it was a great experience. I wouldn't trade it. But at the same time, if I did it again, I'd come in with much more realistic assumptions and not imagine that I could do a full-time job and start a company and be a dad and a husband and be successful at all of that. So I wouldn't try that again. I'd love to do it again, but I'd do it in some different way, I think.
Well, I think my biggest mistake is falling in love with technologies that are different and maybe out of favor, but this one actually works. Everything else that people have tried this way doesn't, and the market thinks, man, we're not going to take a chance on that. You know, whether it's in an indication that where there's failure after failure, like brain cancer, or a particular type of therapeutic like oncolytic viruses that, you know, always have promise, but investors don't have a lot of successes to point to. And I think with one thing we got with Courier with a IL-2 story that in a day when nobody cared about it, but we got lucky that the market turned. So I would say sometimes if you can hang on, the cycle can change, and you can end up in a very popular place. I mean, people who started working on, you know, RNA-based therapeutics 4 or 5 years ago are probably feeling pretty good right now. But you know, timing is a lot. So that's I guess that's the number one mistake, and then the other one is probably it's hard to me. It's been hard to know when to stomp on the gas and try to hire the team that can get the larger funding, because getting up, you know, you hit milestones pretty easily right now. I mean, this is the easiest time for you to make real substantial progress. A few $100,000, you do an experiment, it clears a checkbox for people, but you get to the point where you have to start manufacturing a biologic. I mean, it's expensive, and that's a big step in capital. So you know, I think figuring that one out is always been a little bit. To me it's a challenge to know exactly when to do that. And the market has changed over the last few years substantially. It used to be that there wasn't so much early stage capital. Now it is. Now there is. And last few years I've been sort of adjusting to that, where you had to sort of be really careful. And now, you know, maybe there is more capital, but I'm not sure more deals get funded. It's just more capital for the deals that do get funded. So,
I want you to expand on, because I think you guys all had elements of this in the various stories that you were telling. Time is not your friend, but sometimes you need to be patient, right? So sometimes you need to take a little time and check some boxes, like what Dan said, but also time is not your friend. So just, I don't know if you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, happy to expand on time is not your friend. You know, and I think it's situational or relative. And what I mean by that is, like, say you're in a biotech, you're well funded. Imagine in the future, you've launched a company, you've gotten a chunk of funding, and you're starting your clinical trials, and you had an expectation for how it would enroll, but enrollment's a lot slower than you thought. But you still got to keep the lights on, you still got to pay salaries, you still got to do things, and you're burning capital at a rate that was not anticipated. And now you start to run into these moments where you have to go back and get additional capital, but you haven't hit the milestones that you thought you were going to hit when you first raised that capital. And so time is not your friend there. So being able to be realistic, and the way to get realistic is talk to a lot of people, really try and understand what you're committing to and how you can manage some of the downsides that's going to come when you jump into the different stages. And each stage is a little bit different. The clinical stage is the most expensive stage, and so you want to be really sensitive here. For me, when we were trying to launch a company, there was this dual pressure that I described. So I had to kill it. I was in the mid-stage biotech, publicly traded biotech at the time, and I wasn't part of the management team, but I knew the management team well, and they knew what I was trying to do, and they were supportive. But how long that support's going to last is a little bit amorphous. So I had an opportunity to. They were great. We were using the building that we're in at night, and we could come in on the weekends, and we were building a team to be able to do that. But after about 8 months, they were like, look, you guys gotta, this is untenable. One, you're an employee, and two, we need to make sure you're doing your job, and three, you're using our facilities. And the loss of that access really knocked the wind out of our sails as we move forward. So, it's always relative, but the longer it takes, the harder it is to keep it going. So, trying to find some early momentum and build on that is incredibly important. And I wish there was some, magic thing that I could say that would be the insight that you all need to not run into this, but that's just not the case. You're all going to run into it. It's just part of the whole startup formation, and so just you're always thinking about planning for it, risk mitigating against it, and accepting that those moments are going to happen as you move forward.
Tom, was yours a university technology?
Yeah, it was a university technology that we were working on spinning out.
Would you have started could you have gone longer if you kind of kept it in the university environment, built the IP for longer, and
yeah, that's
not sort of hit the go button?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we were trying to build a team and also license it, and so the licensing process took forever. I didn't expect that, and that was my first time getting to that. Now I know that, oh my God, it's going to take a long time, and there's probably a lot of people in this room that have had some experience with that as well. And we had some really great experts that were sort of setting up to, as soon as we got it, we could kickstart it. But they were on a clock too, right? So they were working as consultants for equity, and they were trying to make ends meet. And so, the whole thing just unraveled on us.
I have a couple of questions. So, for you, when you said that you didn't find right audience for both of you actually, so when was the right time that you, first of all, how much effort you put into improving the technology before jumping the ship or abandoning the project or looking for greener pasture? That is first question. And the second question about right audience. So is it because the competitive landscape or that the technology itself has some weakness and you didn't find traction? What was the reason?
Yeah, I guess I can start with the second question. For us, I think we found investors that were willing to put in, fairly reasonable chunks of money for a seed stage. We had raised about $2.5 million, but it was from individuals who were just high net worth and didn't understand the biotech industry. So that's what I mean. I think they couldn't ask the right questions to even address some of your questions. And all they knew was, there are $1 billion drugs out there, and there's a high return on investment here, and I think they weren't educated enough on what it took to get to that point before they wrote a check. So then they had unrealistic expectations in terms of, you know, how the company would move forward. So, you know, I don't think that's a terribly common situation, but it is, you know, something to caution against. I think that, you know, not all money is good money, which is a hard lesson to learn when you're just starting out and, you know, you just need some funds to keep going. But it's important to be thoughtful about the investors that you bring in and make sure that they are true partners who are willing to, you know, help you out along the way. So, you know, that's kind of the second question. And then your first question was,
How much effort you put into improving technology?
yeah, and that's also, you know, you can keep going and optimizing forever, but you also have to know when, you know, perfect is the enemy of good. And I think that's something, you know, that you can get a sense of by looking at what's happening elsewhere in the market, talking to advisors and investors, and getting really critical feedback on what you're doing and where the holes are. And if the holes are gaping, then yes, you're absolutely gonna need to keep going and improving. But if it's like, well, you know, what you have looks pretty good, maybe you could improve the potency slightly, or, you know, something like that. You know, at some point, I think it's not worth the effort to do that, and you just have to kind of move forward and hit the gas. But I think talking to others in the space and looking at what's happening in the market, the competitive landscape around you is the best way to sort of gauge that.
Yeah, I want Dan to comment on that as well, because he talked about knowing when to be patient and when to hit the gas. But and what Leah said is absolutely important. You know, if you think about it from a molecule perspective, there are certain attributes that you just gotta have in order for it to be able to move forward. I'll just take it up a level from more of a, I guess, philosophical point of view. You know, I talk to people about the art of the start all the time. You know, if you just think about it and tinker with it and keep thinking about it and tinkering with more, at some point you're counterproductive. Like, go start, right? And what happens when you start, usually, almost always, you don't know everything, but you begin to learn as you push things forward. And then as long as you're open to the learnings and reflective back on what you're doing, you start to build a great story and a great case, and actually really generate credibility with investor sets as well, because they like to see people who are paying attention and learning as they move along. Now, that's not, you can't do that if you have a molecule that's not ready. You know, there are certain attributes that you have, but you can do that in the other aspects of your startup to get moving and start learning.
You know, it's very situational, but I think a number of companies here probably have to build their intellectual property out a bit more. And sometimes there's a little bit of a question mark. How far do you go talking to people about your new target or show them your data, a lot of your data, until you build out a little bit more intellectual property? And I say that because universities typically do a pretty terrible job of drafting the you think, oh, they've got that covered. They don't. Just assume that they don't, and you need to look at it and think about it. If there's something in it that you might, it's not that somebody's going to go copy you. Every company's busy. They're talking to is super busy. But you start talking about it publicly, you may reduce your chances of getting intellectual property and building on it later because you publicly disclosed things. So I think that's one early consideration I see pretty often, that people, especially if you have something that's sort of remarkable and unexpected, do you spend a little bit of extra time doing some experiments to build out that intellectual property before you make it public, in which case you kind of have to stop because everything else might become anticipated by your own prior art. So that's a reason not to move super fast. But even then, a lot of times you can go out and get market validation of will companies, the larger companies that your investors expect to buy your product or buy your company, do they care about this area? And I think that's not always easy feedback to get, and it's not always easy feedback to actually take. If the answer is no, they're not going to be interested, then you have to worry about the timing issue. But starting a company and then going and hiring a CEO that may or may not be the ideal CEO is can be kind of a mistake. And sometimes we've stood up companies and sort of put a placeholder in or done something where we're not making a total commitment on the CEO yet, because if you go out and you hire a CEO that can't move it forward or is the wrong person, then you could just write the whole thing off right there, perhaps. And so part of what the trick here is, how do you build? You've got all these places to build value and all these people to sell it to, which includes the strategic you need feedback from. You need to get advisors and managers that are good, and so you need something to sell to them, because the good managers will evaluate you almost the same way that a venture capitalist will. So I think it's, like I said, it's really very situational, but very often I see folks starting out a little bit too soon, and time is not your friend once you start the burn. So you start to burn money. But before that, if it takes an extra 6 months or a year, I personally, I'd be interested in what others think, but time to market for your product, it isn't like software where, get there first. You got to get there. And so lighting up the burn fast and getting some uneducated investors, maybe they'll give you money, but you spend it in the wrong way. You don't hit milestones that are appropriate. You don't have the support for them to help you raise the next round. You've maybe kind of gotten going a little too fast, whereas if you got a little bit more data, a little bit more clarity on how you fit with strategics and build a stronger advisory, perhaps potential bench for investors, if that takes an extra year before you actually quote unquote launch a company, it might be a year well spent. I don't want to tell people to slow down, and I like moving fast, but a lot of these things, like getting your license in place, takes a while. Investors want to know it. Some universities are very difficult about that. Some are easier. The ones that are difficult, you're going to have to sort of figure some things out along the way. So,
Dan, can you highlight something? You said something that I thought was just really interesting. Because I had another question I was going to move to, but I thought it was a really good point, which is the good people, managers or whoever, are evaluating you while you're evaluating them, and how that plays into trying to pull together an early stage team. So, because I think it's easy to say, like, it seems obvious, but I don't know if it really is sometimes when you're trying to pull together a team.
yeah, what's the old, I wouldn't want to be a member of a club that would have me as a member kind of thing. And, it's sort of, if your company's unformed and you haven't done everything, maybe it's somebody can see right through it and see the potential, but also you might, anyway, just, I've seen companies hire CEOs even out of industry that I just like scratch my head over why, and I think it slows them down more than waiting. I don't know if that.
Yeah, just because they have a farm, to your point, just because they have the credentials doesn't mean that they're good.
But the little deck that you'll work on, everybody will have a deck of like, here's my pitch or my deck, or here's my explanation of what I'm doing. It's not just for investors.
Yeah.
Is I think the main thing is for getting advisors and for strategic advice, and ultimately partially for recruiting good managers.
Just the fuzzy process, that's a huge part of this program. That's what I want to highlight, Tom.
Yeah, so, and you guys are the second class or cohort, if you will, so we heard a lot in the first one, and I'm sure this is on your mind. It's like, well, how do I build a team? Who's the business person on the other side? How do I think about that? And there's no set steps that you go through. It is a bit of an organic process, but there's some basic kind of human elements we've all experienced about going through school, and you were on group projects and you were the person doing all the work and there were other people just kind of hanging out, and that same phenomenon can exist as you grow your team in a startup company. The things to look for from my perspective, as a team, you're going to be judging each other, and investors will judge you from, I always say, from a credibility standpoint. Can these people do what they say they're going to do? And if they can't, are they self-aware enough to know that they can? And that's the key thing. And self-awareness for me is, being curious, asking questions, trying to understand, what the strengths of the people that I'm surrounding myself with are, and where they're not strong, and then how do you sort of gap fill if you need to, or make decisions that maybe we don't need that skill set right now. It's too early to bring on a CEO. We just need really good project management right now. So those kinds of like being curious, inquisitive about the people that you would assemble around the project as you think about the team is true, and look for people that are curious and inquisitive about you. If you're like, hey, we really would love your regulatory advice, and the first thing they do is slide a consulting contract in front of you, be wary of that, right? Just be open to, like, somebody's like, yeah, let's talk a little bit, let's get coffee, let's start, and you can start to build a relationship and understand where they're coming from. It's incredibly important early on to be thoughtful, to question, to be curious, in order to build a great team around you.
You've been doing a lot of hiring lately. So.
I have been doing a lot of hiring. Yeah. I think the only thing I would add, in what I've kind of landed on, I started as the only full-time employee for Hummingbird in the U.S., and now we have 8 in Houston and 4 others in the U.S. But I think one thing that I think a lot about is hiring for mindset over skill set sometimes. You may have somebody that has like this perfect pedigree of experience, and maybe it's in big pharma, maybe it's wherever, but if they're not kind of the roll up your sleeves team player that is needed when you have a very small team and are in a fast-paced startup environment, then it is not going to work out. So you need people that are comfortable with the gray, with not having everything black and white and well-defined, and who are really willing to reach out of their comfort zone and just pitch in and help out wherever it's needed within the company, because you don't have the full expertise in every single area that you need to get the company off the ground. So you really just need smart people who are willing to work hard and get the job done.
So how do founders prepare themselves for, like, they hire or they started working with a CEO and CFO, but everyone is evaluating everyone, right? So people are always going up, they want to go up, right? So they see, okay, this company is not doing great, or they find they are looking for something better. So at the same time, so how do founders prepare themselves for, okay, this person will most likely gonna leave, or so how?
Well, hopefully you don't hire that person that's
No, you never know, right?
right.
I'm saying just that you don't know that this person
Yeah.
will leave.
I think that's a lot of that kind of evaluation on both sides that we're talking about. Hopefully you find someone who didn't just slide you the contract and ask for the salary or the equity, but that heard your story and really bought in and believed it and is also personally invested in it as well. That's difficult to evaluate, or have check the box criteria on, but I think it's more kind of something that you'll gain, or you'll kind of determine based on the relationship and the discussions that you have with that individual, what their motivation is. Is it to just move up and move on, or are they committed to building something?
Well, and I don't know what you're seeing, but the war for talent right now and the cost of somebody
Yes.
that may not even be entrepreneurial, but they've been working for a big company for
Yeah.
years, and now they're expecting to come out and make $400,000 a year plus 50% bonus plus plus, and I don't really think those people are the right people necessarily
No.
for a startup.
No.
And you might take an earlier career person
Yep.
with a lot of fire in the belly early, with the idea that they may become have a different role in the organization as you grow.
That's
But-
exactly the strategy.
But unless that
Yeah.
expensive, that person that says they love it so much they're willing to work for equity and they're like
Yeah.
totally committed, maybe you get lucky and find that person. But man, I just it seems so salary driven these days that I'm skeptical of whether those people can really function well. I've seen them fail in startups, in well-funded startups.
Define entrepreneurial, like why, because I think this conversation about compensation early on and people deserve to be, I'm a strong believer, people deserve to be compensated, right? And you should open up that conversation yourself once you're capable, but why is the contract across the table such an issue? Or why is they're coming from Amgen, why shouldn't they get paid $400,000? They could get paid $400,000 a year. Why does it make you think that they're not entrepreneurial, I guess is my question. How would you define that? 'Cause I think it's pretty.
Oh, well, they may well be. My experience is that there's fewer that are coming out of the larger companies. I'd almost rather have somebody who's had failed in an earlier startup and decide they want to do it again and learn from their failures, because
Maybe they didn't learn from their.
having all the
mistakes.
resources you have in one of those large companies is, what you're comfortable with is having a lot of resources. So if you've got a lot of dollars to spend, not just the salary, but all the support that person expects, and is different from having a scrappier person that maybe, like I said, has been maybe failed a couple of times, but still wants to give it a go. I wouldn't judge somebody who failed in a startup negatively. I'd value it. So.
Yeah, so the compensation piece, especially when you think about starting a company, it's incredibly important because you want to get great people around, because that's what's going to make the thing fly. And to both Leah and Dan's point, you want to make sure that the people are committed, and y'all know this in your professional lives, incentives matter, right? So if the person's just getting paid a lot of cash, and they'll get paid a lot of cash no matter what happens in startup, that's pretty misaligned, right? They're just going to get paid. But if you turn it into an equity component where they can make material wealth if it goes on to be successful, then you have a better chance of having them engaged longer term, because they're going to say, look, I've gone this far with it and it's not that far away, so I'm going to hang in there until we get to this next inflection point, at least to manage this concern that they might be there for a little bit and then leave. So as you launch a company and you're talking to the talent that you're trying to attract around it, and you're talking to investors, understanding things like cap table structure, how people are incentivized to stay with the project, really, really important. We could spend hours on talking about that alone, but pay attention to it, because it does matter. Just because somebody has a great set of experience doesn't mean that they're gonna show up every day and bring it like you need to when you're trying to get something off the ground.
Okay, we have time for like one or two more points of discussion before, and then we're gonna take a quick break, and then we're gonna kick Tom out. We're gonna bring in JR, and Dan and Leah are staying. So.
Upgrade coming after the break.
So I think a good way to at least finish this hour, especially while we have you here, Tom, is, but I want everybody to weigh in, because I think all of you have seen this ecosystem changes. The way the Texas ecosystem has evolved in the last 10 years, the way the resources have changed, how does that make you feel? Do you still think this is a challenging place to build a company, or do you think there's reason for hope, or A and B? What are you thinking about?
Yeah, two thoughts on Texas. So I've only been in Texas now, coming on 5 years. I came from Boston, much different, mature market. So the macro picture of Texas is kick-ass, right? If you think about the Texas Triangle, and how it's attracting people and capital, and it's, you know, for the top 10 fastest growing megaplexes in the country. I think from a macroeconomic perspective, Texas is a great place to be. From a biotech perspective, it's still an emerging market. You know, I will, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And Dan and Leah will have some thoughts about that as well. I am optimistic about it because I see more people, especially in the academic institutions, where I hear them talking more about commercialization, even over the last few years than I did when I first showed up. You know, in the Boston market, everybody's focused on commercialization, and that's a long legacy of MIT driving that as part of their DNA, their culture of doing that. So, you know, we need to continue to drive the institutions here in Texas to be more focused on commercialization, thinking more sort of, I think, market-driven tech transfer practices, and getting more collaborative early stage, and trying to make that happen, because there's a lot of great work that goes on here in Houston and across the state, you know, culturally, Texas has always been pro-business, entrepreneurial, friendly. So it feels like those two things just need to start to match up a little bit better. And you know, 5 years from now, we'll feel much better about it. So just two thoughts: that Texas, big picture, I think it's a really great place for all of us to be. And then from a biotech, still emerging, hoping that we continue to have conversations around being better, more efficient in commercialization.
Well, one of the disadvantages that Texas has had, and may still have for a while, is in the universities, most people don't have the exposure early on in their research. So that I actually see a lot of things that are sort of more Me Too coming out of universities, and they have to be kind of thoughtful about, am I doing something that's already been fully funded, you know, gone through a full funding cycle, and everybody's got their bets in other places. So, you know, ultimately, I think we'll get better as we get a better ecosystem, that research will start earlier, thinking about what are the you know, proof points that I need to do. So that the other thing I see is that they haven't done the experiment that really matters sometimes. And I think that if you're in an ecosystem with a lot of venture, your colleagues have been in venture-funded companies, that becomes easier to identify early on. So, so that, you know, but other than that, I think that you know, you can pull talent from anywhere. People these days, you know, your team can be partially anywhere. I don't think there's a big disadvantage to being here at all. I think it's a great ecosystem to start a company in.
I will say the universities need some work.
Yeah, I mean,
Some
it's cultural. I mean,
places-
you talk about the tech transfer, but I agree with you, like, the you know, the PIs and the postdocs need to be thinking about commercialization early on, right? And trying to focus on it, and not so much trying to, you know, follow something like, go think about commercialization early on. And that's a big cultural shift, I get it, but I think it's really important.
So can I ask a question here? So along this line, I think for Dan, you also mentioned earlier you know, the cycle of change, the wave of changing, right? So right now, like immunotherapy is hot, and the AI is hot, and the RNA-based therapy are very hot. So maybe I would think that from the perspective of funding and investor point of view, you would go after these technologies. But how about those ones that, you know, really novel, not have been proof concept approved, and in the new area, uncharted area? I mean, as a PI for ourselves, we don't really switch area all the time. If I'm working on small molecule, probably I will not work on the you know, immunotherapy or larger molecules for short time, change the area, right? So we usually focus on one area, go very deep, and develop technologies. So for you guys, when you look at these things, how do you say, okay, you know, I want to fund this, I want to go with the wave, you know, immunotherapy. You know, this new area I want to fund. So what's your point of that side?
A great question, and really difficult to answer, because, you know, Dan mentioned, these things are very situational, so you're gonna look at each opportunity individually. Generally, I think that there's a set of principles that when you spend some time in biotech or in pharma or in drug development in general, you're gonna get a sense for the art of the possible, or what is possible, and versus like, if you go talk to Billy Cohn down the road, he's got a great analogy for this, is like, well, that's cool tech, but first we have to build a time travel machine, travel in the future, figure this out, and then come back, and then we can work on it right now. So, it has to have kind of a feasibility component to it. It can be novel, it can be a new space, but you have to be able to tell the story about like, this is the steps, and this is the key experiment that de-risks the novelty around this, and here's the intellectual property strategy, etc. If it's like, hey, it's an antibody, like I think everybody from a modality perspective is like, yeah, okay, it's an antibody, but then you're talking about the target and the novelty of the target, and then specifically around the antibody that you're generating, and you're in a great place. Perfect. I actually had, I'll tell this one story before I checked out. I was working at Shire in the rare disease space, and Shire was making its name in enzyme replacement therapy, right? So making proteins, injecting them IV, the proteins would go on the lysosomal pathway and would correct lysosomal storage disorders, right? So, and that's a huge, huge business. But it's like, well, there are a ton of other monogenetic disorders where there's a missing protein, but you can't get proteins from the bloodstream into the nucleus, or you can't get them into the cytosol, at least not very effectively. And it's like, well, then, the whole gene therapy piece. But the guy I was working for, Mike Hartline, which is one of the best industrial entrepreneurs I've ever worked with, was like, why don't we just use RNA, right? So he started working on using RNA in lipid nanoparticles and laying down IP for that in 2008. And was competing with Derek Rossi when the Rossi IP went to go to meet Moderna. And Shire had this thing, had it, owned all the IP. So I show up in 2010, I'm talking to Mike, he's showing me the animal data, and I'm like, holy shit, this is unbelievable how well this works. And we're talking to Shire management, not to be named individuals, saying like, this, we really need to pivot and go to this. And they're like, RNA, you can't scale RNA, like, you ever try and make RNA in the lab? It's impossible. Like, this whole sort of conversation that we got ourselves in. So like, we're like, screw it, like, let's spin it out. Will you let us talk to people to spin it out? And they're like, yeah, you can talk to people to spin it out. And we talked to all the blue chip VCs, and I knew Bruce Booth at Atlas, and Bruce wanted to fund it, and then Arch wanted to fund it as well. We had a term sheet for a $40 million Series A, right? Shire saw that, and they're like, oh wait, maybe it is good, right? And so they wouldn't let us spin it out. So then I quit, because I'm like, this is ridiculous, right? And I went to J&J, but Mike stayed with it, and eventually that technology was spun out into Translate Bio, and then Translate Bio just got acquired by Sanofi for multiple billions. Shire lost out on all of that. They just lost all of it. They let it go. I'm sure they got some a little bit, but that whole opportunity was there. They could have been Moderna, they could have been Pfizer, but it was different. It didn't make sense to them. They couldn't get their head around it, a particular individual for certain. And it's just one of the most frustrating experiences I've ever had. It's like, ooh, there's the one that got away, because I was on the ground working on that. So, there is that element when you do something completely different that that some people don't understand, but others do for sure. Flagship did, so it's a little bit of like grinding it out as you move forward. But so just a thought on that.
Thank you.
I think one of the parts of that story that's really important is that's a platform.
Yeah,
so
true.
Really new platforms that open up a whole new vista, I think are pretty hot right now, and people will spend the time to understand it. It might take a while to convince them, but I've seen a few interesting startups out of universities that got grabbed up very early, like by the Arches of the world, that are platform oriented rather than single asset. I think a single asset that's sort of a different, perhaps an area that's been not succeeded before, can be a lot tougher slog, in my opinion, than platform where if you're right, it's this cornucopia of potential drugs that you could develop off of it.
I think Sarah wants me to get back to the Texas
Yeah,
question.
well, I think it's a really interesting discussion, so you can either jump off of some of what they're talking about. I have comments to make about tech transfer, and it's not just Shire that screws it up sometimes, but this is your guys' time. So you can either jump off of their conversation, or I'd still, I mean, I think a good way to finish is still thinking about how are the opportunities around here changing, and how to, so whichever aspect you want to.
Okay, I'll go ahead and talk about, the change in the landscape, I guess, kind of circling back to that. I mean, it has changed dramatically since I moved to Texas in 2013. I moved here from the Gaithersburg, Maryland area outside of DC. There's kind of a biotech corridor there. And I moved because my husband had a job in academia here. And he's like, oh, it's the world's largest med center. You're easily going to be able to find a job. No. It was very challenging. There were a handful of really small companies that if they were hiring, maybe it was for something that I would want to do or was qualified to do. But yeah, it was really challenging. So it's still not obviously Boston or San Francisco, but I think there are at least a number of companies here that are fairly reasonably well funded and getting off the ground. And I mean, I think, that's entirely in part due to CPRIT. I agree with everything that has been said about the research and the commercialization aspect. I think looking forward, what we need to do is kind of change the external perception of what biotech in Texas looks like. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen, with my experience with Hummingbird and with, our most recent Series C. There was a really strong belief in the technology and the story, platform technology at that, kind of, re-emphasizing that point. I think anytime you have a non-binary outcome, it's more appealing to investors than the one product investment. But the question that came up most often was, why Singapore and Houston? It's not just one, but two really unexpected areas for establishing a biotech company. And I think that was one of the biggest challenges was, convincing investors, can you do that in these geographies? And, maybe one of the upsides of COVID is convincing people that you can do anything, anywhere, in multiple ways, I think. From a recruiting perspective, historically, what I've seen is it's been really challenging to relocate people here. Because they've thought, okay, if I uproot my family and I move to Houston and this one job in biotech falls through, I don't have 10 other companies that I could hop to. But I think with the opening of remote work and more possibility of that for the reasons that have already been mentioned, cost of living, business friendly, no income tax, I think more people find it appealing to move to Texas and are less afraid to do that because there are remote opportunities that they could potentially pursue. So while I think you can get talent remotely, I think it is helpful to have, some individuals where you are that you can kind of sit down periodically and hash things out with. And I think hopefully that's easier now. But then I think the other piece that I think still needs to change is that external investor perception of, do people in Texas know what they're doing, both on the academic side. I mean, I think there's no doubt that there's sound science, but I think it's the, can they spin out a company that's based in Texas? And I think to change that mindset, we just need to have a few really strong success stories.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to CPRIT right now from the oncology perspective. I mean, that's a long play. CPRIT's been around for over 10 years now, pushed out almost $3 billion, and did it again, right? So, it's really going to be impactful as we continue to build and be long term. I've used this quote a few times because I get the question about Houston comes up a lot in a lot of different contexts. And TMC is a big real estate developer as well, so I have to wear a real estate development hat at times as well. And so one of the biggest companies in life science real estate development is Alexandria. If you're in the Boston market or other markets, they're massive. They're actually coming here. They bought an old HEB site down the road, so Alexandria's first site is going to be here in Texas, so that's a good sign. But so BizNow is a publication, or business publication, and so they're interviewing Joel Marcus, who's the chairman of Alexandria. So they ask him, talking about emerging cities. He's like, they ask him, is there any other place that's getting close? I like to read this quote because it gets all Houstonians in Texas blood boiling a little bit. Houston has incredible medical center and talent. And he answers, Houston's a little like New York used to be. Maybe it's the closest because they have multiple institutions. They do have a location now in the Texas Medical Center where they're trying to coalesce around these institutions. So that's TMC3. The reality, though, is Houston right now, there are not many scientists or academicians or political people who have any experience in translating science. And you really need that. I mean, the Bob Langers of the world out of MIT, literally none of those exist in Houston. F you. Houston's got world-class clinical. That's really their thing. But there are no rock star scientists in the sense of not many Nobel Prize winners or people like that. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be over the next generation. And there's almost no risk capital, even though they're oil. That industry's taking it on the chin. And there's very little management and talent that you can hire. So Houston would still be extremely early on, where New York was 20 years ago. Remember that, all of you. There are no rock star scientists here in Houston. Tattoo that on your mirror, look at it, motivate yourself. Let's prove Alexandria wrong, please. I see JR's here, so maybe that's the time for a break.
We're gonna take I mean JR's already here, but we're gonna take like let's call it a 10-minute break, because I think at the 2 hour of the morning mark, I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to get coffee. So we're gonna take a 10-minute break, and then we're gonna come back, and then we're gonna finish out, because I think there's a few more. Good discussion though. Thank you, Tom.
Talk to you sometime, because you're
Thank you for the story.
we're working on oral cancer, so I think good.
She was telling me I was using for the I'm like, I know I'm going somewhere like that.
So, Tom left us with a really good quote, I think, for jumping out, which is, we don't have a Bob Langer. Although I will say, in the Boston ecosystem, Bob Langer seems to take up a lot of the oxygen. So I think it's actually an opportunity in an ecosystem like this. Is you all could be Bob Langer, right? Or be the Bob Langer of Houston. Probably better. We're going to do the Houston version. We don't need to be the Boston version, right? Or the Texas version. So I think maybe the right place to start to get into this next sort of block is JR. You'll notice does not look like Tom.
Maybe. Probably not.
JR is the head of the TNC.
Better haircut.
JR is the head of the TNC Venture Fund here at Innovation. Just a serial entrepreneur and a great person for thinking about how do you put together companies with. So I'm gonna let him introduce himself more properly, and then we'll just get into it.
Thanks, Sarah. So if you couldn't hear me in the back, Tom Luby with a better haircut. So it's great to be with everyone. Welcome to the Cookie Factory. My name is John Reale. I go by JR. And as Sarah said, I lead our venture fund here for TMC, which is a $25 million fund. We are privileged to partner with 16 different founders through their companies. When we launched this initiative back in 2017, we've had 2.5 exits. We had a partial monetization last year. But primarily to date, we've invested in digital health and med device startups. Background wise, like most entrepreneurs, just a windy road. I was thinking about this last night. I've been part of 5 startups, either as a founder or helping launch those companies directly as a co-founder, and then have been in operating roles at 3 different tech startups as well. So been on the operator side, which is really, the way I think about it as a partner and investor is always trying to walk in, my partner's shoes, which are you, the founders, and think about like what you're trying to build, how you're trying to get there. And that's what we try to do here with our team at TMC. It's really be a partner. How can we walk in your shoes and then, be that thought partner, be that voice, be another person, another group to help you through this, really challenging journey that inspires us. So great to be with everyone this morning.
So, because we talked about this a little bit in the last hour, Jared, I know you have a different perspective. I'm going to kick it back to you because I want to ask you, when you're thinking about attracting people to go start a startup with you and not get paid full salary, how do you, right? So you're like, hey, I have this idea. Come work on this project for me. Don't get paid. I'm going to give you some paper. How do you think about that? How do you think about compensation? How do you think about telling that story?
So storytelling plays such a big part of this, right? Because it's about inspiring action. It's about letting other folks understand and be part of this world that you believe is coming, that you're going to help make happen, and the opportunity for someone to play a role in shaping that future. So I think as a founder, it's one of those pitches to people about, hey, here's what we're going to go do, and I can't pay you. You're gonna make no money. You're gonna leave your job to do this, but oh wow, what an opportunity! So, if you think about that, most folks are like, well, you go back and do like maybe the spouse test, like you go back and tell your spouse, like, hey, I'm gonna quit my high-paying job and go make no money, and because this crazy person thinks this thing is gonna happen in the future. But I think it's a compelling piece if you really buy in to a mission, to a vision. So, what we've seen like a lot of founders do is like the ability for folks to play a role in building the future is something that not everybody has in their current roles and jobs. And that's a fact. Like that is a fact, right? A lot of folks are, they're unhappy in their jobs or, they're marginally happy. Equity, I believe, is a source of accretion. If you're a founder, it's how you could use something to really be accretive and to bring people around, whether they're investors, whether they're people, but it should be a source of accretion versus just dilution. And if you see the world in abundance, and if you see your vision as abundance, I think you think more about the idea of like, here's why there's value to this, and why folks will be on board or get on board with the idea of being able to participate in building the future, and how you participate through equity becomes a source of accretion versus this dilution. So look, I think there's real world pieces of it, like people shouldn't work for free and they shouldn't work and undervalue themselves, but I think there's also a part of what's compelling to do so and know why you want to join something. So using your equity is key, and I'm sure we'll talk about raising capital and when to raise capital and how to think through that as well.
Yeah.
Should.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, no.
Go ahead.
Dan looks like yes.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said. I think as you get into the details, you don't want to just give away equity to everybody without, I think, learn about vesting, learn about how that works, because I've seen lots of even founders groups where one or two of them isn't so serious, but they don't have any way to like reduce their ownership. So using equity thoughtfully in that way, where you're rewarded if you contribute, rewarded if you stay, and you can be really generous to that. And I agree with the thought of don't worry so much about dilution, worry about building value. Right. Is the is the right way to do it.
Yeah.
But definitely learn about vesting before you start to use the equity and to recruit people.
Does everybody here know what vesting is?
Should.
Oh, yeah, okay.
We talked about this. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we were just chatting about it at the break. I think it's really challenging at the outset to, you know, ask somebody to go in full-time, equity only, because equity doesn't pay the bills. So, you know, I agree with JR, you have to have, someone who fits with that shared vision. But if you can't find someone to do that full-time, I think you have to start with, you know, consultants or part-time, and somebody who, again, they have to buy into that, but whatever time they can give you, if they are willing to do that and they believe in what you're doing, even if it's part-time, I think, you know, take them up on that and build from there, and do what you can.
You know, and something to add here, right? It's a journey, right? And none of these things are just like, you know, just a quick line or just A to B or transactional. But it could be as like you're painting this view of what's going to happen. You're also able to share, here's a sequence of events of like, here's the questions we're going to go answer. Here's the things that we've got to go figure out. And if you think about this as like a long kind of nurturing, recruiting, dating scenario, you've got like proof points, you've got learnings to share with other folks to see that like this horizon that you've painted here, it's not about just painting this larger vision of 10, 20 years from now, but it's this set of learnings that we just were able to achieve in the last 3 months, in the last 6 months, which starts to create maybe like a different lens of how folks may see the real viability of what's happening, right? As a founder, your job is to build a movement. It's to get other folks, whether they're advisors, whether they're people to come work with you, investors, clinical partners, whatever it would be, to like come see the world with you. So like being able to like share those things, don't think of it as just deterministic, like I need someone now, so I gotta get someone now. You're cultivating, you're helping people share. You know, one thing we see a lot of, which I think is the best practice, is writing. We've got founders who write weekly updates or monthly updates. And it's not so much about here's all the great things that sounds great and like would be more pat on the back, but it's here's what we're learning. Here's what we're seeing what's happening. Here's how people are reacting to this. This is something we found interesting. And the more you can go on a journey of learning, I think it attracts the right curiosity-minded folks to want to be part of that.
Yeah, I have a point, and thank you very much, and I think I need you to explain better. So, for an early startup, it's not the full-time employee who will come to work for you for nothing. Let's be fair. There are people who are working in 7 different places and come exactly what you said, come to help you on a specific peculiar aspect of your company. How can we rely on these people that they don't have conflict of interest with what we are doing in the company? So how we are pretty sure that what they are doing for our company is not released in another places where they still work also part-time? So what are your advices on this, let's say, on the ground reality? Because full-time is very difficult to have when you don't have too much money, you rely on it on SBIR or STTR and on a small ground. You don't pay full-time.
So the question I heard was, you know, how do you not only just get people to come work for you because you're early stage, but how do you rely on them to be a good steward of your technology? Is that the right gist of your company? And you know, JR, you know, what I heard you say, if it's okay if I restate what I heard you say, is you're not really looking for someone to work for you, you're looking for somebody to work with you, and there's a distinction there.
Yeah, to that point, I think that's absolutely, I share in that view. I mean, because I think like anytime you're trying to build something, I believe it's more of like the learnings and actions of many versus just the genius of one. So it's like, how do you give people ownership to like run with something, to have a voice, to go do something with you in that process? Now, I think like more like specifically, hey, how do you monitor whether or not they're putting the right kind of mind share I think so much of those things get into how do you build alignment into knowing why this is the right person, right group, what's the right referral source, or how do they come into your sphere? Like, it's one of the things I think we think about here at KMC is how do we find really great partners that at least we've vetted, we've spent time with to help with that, right? So if you think about the team that you have here with Sarah and Enrique, spend all this time like understanding like, hey, who are folks that we believe we can rely on? I think the same onus goes on all of you about, hey, why is someone this right person, and how are you engaging with them? If it's just like, look, here's this thing, drop ship, come back and see me in X when it's done, there's probably a set of like iteration that needs to happen of whether or not that's correct or incorrect. So like this is the many hats that you hear about as a founder that you have to wear to do so, but I think it's inviting people in so the pride or the mind share. I have a good friend. She's an investor in one company. She's a venture capitalist up in Boston. And she went from one firm to the other, and she was doing some advisory work for a couple of different startups. And the thing I would ask her is like, who are you thinking about when you're waking up in the morning? Like, because that's probably the folks that you want. You want to probably start moving away from the folks that you're not to the groups that you're waking up thinking about. And I think that's one of the things, right? Or one of maybe like soft skills as a founder is how do you, as a partner, convey those different ideas, what we're trying to do, so when people are waking up in the morning, they're thinking of you, they're thinking of the company, they're thinking of the mission they get to be a part of. So that's kind of the way I think of it, and that's part of, I think, the art or the magic of being an entrepreneur.
Right. I'm gonna shift a little bit because there was a couple threads that I had made notes I wanted to follow up on from before, which is, but it plays into this concept of telling a story, right? So one of the interesting things about biotech is that it is data driven, right? A lot of, especially at these early stages, it's very, you're trying to tell a story, but you're telling it to people who tend to be pretty technical themselves, even the investors. And so, Leah, you made a comment earlier about data packages and highlighting the right data. And so, Dan, I know you've seen the opposite as well, where it's like, okay, you're kind of hitting me over the head with the data, and I can't even tell what's the key, what's the important bits here. So how do you think about data packages and filtering and the key experiments?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really comes down to understanding how you're differentiated from everybody else that's trying to do whatever it is you're trying to do. So, if it's a cancer therapeutic, which is what everyone is here to do, is it, better in this particular type of cancer? How do you know it's better? What have you done to prove that? Is it more efficacious? Is it safer? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? What is the unmet need that is out there in the market? And really that needs to be the foundation for any pitch or any data package that you put together. Yes, it has to be, thorough, but every single, minutia experiment that you did to get to that point does not need to be part of your bigger story. The bigger story really needs to be that take-home message of why is your technology different or better than anything else that's out there, and what are the studies that you have done that demonstrate that without a doubt? Have you done kind of head-to-head comparisons? Have you used the most relevant model for the indication that you expect to target? So I think it's just kind of trying to sit in the investor's shoes and think about they see so many different things. How do you make your technology stand out, and how do you convince them that what you have is better than anyone else who's trying to do the same thing?
So related to that question, head-to-head comparison. So as in your company, for example, if an academic founder contact you for your product, just to testing head-to-head comparison, what is in your experience, did you get such requests? frequently, and how does your company respond to it?
I mean, we would never give our product. So I think the question is, how would my company respond to someone asking to use our compound or our product? I think like most companies, we're very cautious and protective of that. Even for kind of just research purposes, having a material transfer agreement, particularly when you have a molecule that's in the clinic, is almost a no-go, because you don't want to see other people do something that may produce data that's potentially damaging. But we did, as part of our Series C fundraising, we had multiple comparisons with competitor antibodies, and the way that we did that was, they have published sequences. We made the antibodies ourselves. And did the head-to-head comparisons there. And I think that was really impactful to say, the premise of my company's technology is that we're able to develop antibodies more precisely to a functional region of interest on a target than anyone else. So to be able to demonstrate that, we have to show our antibody versus another. And I think that was what was most compelling about the pitch that we had, and how we were successfully able to raise our Series C.
It's worth restating, there's nothing to stop you from just resynthesizing other people's products. They're not gonna give it to you, but there's nothing. Their patents only stop commercialization.
And those folks that want to test your product, a lot of times they just really want to learn from it. It may not, even if they don't publish damaging data, they're learning from you, and I've never seen that work out really well. I don't know, it's just something to be very cautious about. I think once you've answered the question, how you're different, then you're going to run into the what I would call the easy objections. Oh, but are you going to create neutralizing antibodies? Are you going to? You're very familiar with that one. You can only you can answer it. Oh, we did this. Oh, but but I still think you are. And they're kind of easy dismissals in a way, or oh, can you how do you know you can manufacture this? And so getting some exposure to the ultimate partners or funders and hearing that, and you'll hear the same thing we talked to 3 or 4, and you'll hear all you need to hear. Gives you kind of a work assignment to go back and what experiments you might need to do to top off your story. And I think one thing that scientists always want to do is do something that's they can publish in Nature and has a p-value whatever 0.005. You don't have to do that. It often doesn't have to be that rigorous. But you've got to, if you have no answer for that question, we don't know yet. I think that can really stall things out sometimes, especially if you have something kind of new and different that you haven't, that's unproven. For instance, the manufacturability.
Dan, you're giving me flashbacks. No, I mean it's a fair point.
What's the story, Sarah? Can you share the story?
Can I share the story? So talking about, I think the neutralizing antibodies is one that comes up pretty commonly. So if you have a fusion protein, you are putting together sequences in a way that your body hasn't seen before, right? By definition, theoretically could be immunogenic. And so really easy stopping question, particularly for the associate or somebody who's trying to prove that they're sharp, and that they're paying attention, that they, are bringing the right level of suspicion to this conversation, is to say, well, it's just going to be neutralized. You should just have done this with an antibody, because of course antibodies don't actually do sometimes, but they don't generally produce neutralizing antibodies. And so we were working with a protein that we thought we had every scientific reason to say this is not going to be an issue, right? Every scientific reason. The whole premise of the targeting ligand was that it was created to be a stealth protein to the immune system. But it's just you can't get past. You can say that scientifically, you can say whatever you want, but you can't get past that question, because so as soon as you just go and do the experiment, it only takes a few weeks. It's always easier than you think it's going to be once you figure out what those easy dismissal questions are. They're usually not very expensive or difficult to address. They're really boring to address, but they're not difficult. You just go do the experiment, and you're like, look, no antibodies, and then you get past the question, right? and then you just have your easy answer. I liken it to, maybe because this was for me, I was coming more recently out of an academic setting. My strategy for when I got through the qualifying exams, everybody got really stressed about it. Was like, I don't have to answer all the questions. I have to just get through enough questions before I hit the ones I can't answer, right? Because then they'll assume I did my homework. And so that was my strategy. Maybe that's not a good strategy, but that was my strategy. So that's the story. So I think, and there was a few other things like that. So you just knock them down. You don't.
But I think in that case, the real way to put that to bed was to do a non-human primate work.
Yeah.
And that's expensive, but not crazy expensive.
Yeah.
But it takes a long time.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to set up and do. And you're as a startup, you're always thinking, wow, that's going to take a year. We need to figure out an easier way to do it. And I think that was going back, doing that, spending the money and doing that early would have probably been money well spent to get over that particular.
It's always easy to look back and figure that out.
Yeah, and but you have to start. It's one of those things you have to start. A year, 9 months or a year before you need the data.
Yeah, and so you're like, well, it's going to take a year. We'll do, whatever. But what happens is if you can't get over those easy stopping pushes, if they do become something that's a repeatable thing, you'll end up going a year. And you're like, oh, I should have started a year ago. Now you're a year later. So this is the kind of work actually that I have the opinion now. I don't think I had the opinion then, but now I have the opinion because now I know how much easier it is to just work with people. So you can, even if you're a small company, you can do things relatively cheaply. That's the kind of work that makes really nice SBIR. Because if it takes you 9 months to get funded, you'll keep trying to do whatever you're doing. Maybe you do or you don't have the funds. You just write it into SBIR. You kind of get that process rolling in parallel, and then you keep trying to figure out what you're doing. So hopefully at some point you haven't lost that time.
Sarah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So like, to Dan's point, maybe for everyone, what are some of the learnings about what is money well spent early on when you're not necessarily either capitalized or well capitalized? Any things that become more patterns about?
Maybe if you have funds, it's just worth figuring out where you put it.
Depending on what you have, I think extra dollars in IP. Now, it may not matter if you have. I don't know what you guys think about it, because anybody's, nobody else is going to develop the exact same antibody. You probably have to wait a bit on that.
Yeah.
But if you have something where you don't really even want to talk to people about it, so you have IP and then you've got sort of this window where you have it published and you can actually generate more intellectual property on it. I would say in the current example, we spent $200,000 in the first year and a half on IP, and it was absolutely totally worth it.
Yeah,
100%.
It's still paying off.
And we had ideas that we didn't even do that. Ultimately we got data on later. We followed some prophetic provisionals, but really well done. That I think ultimately led to a lot of value creation. And that's not every case. But we actually had a philosophy of we get a really good attorney we really like to draft it, and then we get another attorney to review it, and we ended up it was that important to us in that particular situation.
I think it's deviating from JR's question, but on the IP note, we have kind of taken
a different path actually, but I think it's an important consideration to throw out there. So we have a platform technology. It consists of kind of two components. We have a computational piece that allows us to identify the best region of a protein to target, and then we have kind of the implementation of that. How do we actually, in a very focused way, develop an antibody against that region that we're trying to hit? And rather than patenting that, we have chosen not to, because then we have chosen to keep that as a trade secret. So we kind of have this written up, ready to file should we ever need to, but we keep pushing it because we don't want it to be published and out there, because when it is, then someone else could potentially.
Because it's hard to protect. You
Yes.
can't necessarily detect if somebody is using
Yes.
some of those ideas in a final product.
Yes.
That's a real big difference.
So yeah. So like I said, kind of a deviation from JR's original question, but I think an important note to hit is to think about what and you know, it's not gonna be something you're gonna solve yourself, but work closely with your IP attorneys and your tech transfer office on that strategy and whether, you know, something should be patented or it's something that you are trying to keep as a trade secret.
Was that ever academically published?
No.
See, that's a challenge you all have, because you're
Mhm.
all motivated to publish, and I've seen that you really limit the IP that you can get. So sometimes you have to give up your desire to have a high impact publication in order to give yourself time to develop the IP.
We got George in the
If I
back
can
there.
jump in, so this is a very important point, because a lot of time with the scientists discussing with our institutions, they push or not publish and keep it. Now, how sure you are on your technology that no other group from this little world will publish and will take everything by simple publication without neither thinking to make an intellectual property. In our life as scientists, it happens so frequently that we wake in the morning, you said to what we are thinking in the morning. When I wake up, I'm thinking, am I screwed up by another group or by
Sounds like a good reason to pay your attorney, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's challenging. You never know for sure that someone's not out there doing that. I mean, I think, you know, in our case, we have kind of those two components, like I said, so it's a little bit more challenging. You would have to crack both sides. But in addition to that, we are, I guess, thinking of, you know, that's the way that the company got off the ground. That's how we have generated our first products. But now we are thinking of strategies to kind of make that more sound from an IP perspective for the future. So I think, you know, it's a great point, and it's essentially the operating mode that we have right now, but you can't think that that's gonna be the default forever, and you have to think ahead as to how do you protect yourself down the road. And we don't have that answer yet, but we're actively looking into it.
Yeah. I think, if I can just jump in, I think you have to assume other people are doing it. Look, use the RNA example, right? Nobody was investing in RNA, except for there was a handful, right? You know, you had Flagship and BioNTech and Shire apparently, and two of those got it right, and one of them didn't, right? And you know, so you have to assume, and like CRISPR is another great example. It doesn't matter how cutting edge it is, I just always assume there's other smart people in the world. And you're working under the best, you know, if it's, you know, you're hoping that you're gonna be better or faster or whatever. So I think the faster question, or something else I wanted to make sure we really hit on, because I think it's come up a few times this week, is, you know, faster. We talked about it earlier today too. When do you go slow, when do you go fast? And I think that plays into grant, you know, when's the right time to do grants, academic or SBIR or CPRIT, which still has a lag, versus when do you just go try and raise venture money? And how do you think about that trade-off of dilution versus time? And Leah, I know you have a ton, you're doing both, so.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just wouldn't think of them as mutually exclusive. Like, I think you need to pursue all avenues, because as you well know, with grant funding, nothing's guaranteed. So you may think you've written the best grant in the world, but you may get it, you may not. It's a pretty subjective process. And, you know, I think I would say pursue both, and don't count on getting either one. You know, that's the strategy that I think the companies that I have worked with have pursued in the past. And, you know, then when you do get one, that's great. But when you're calculating out and thinking about what you can do in the next year or 2 years, you know, until that money is in the bank, you know, you don't plan for it. So I mean, that's kind of my strategy, is that I think you have to pursue any and all opportunities for funding in hopes that one of them will hit.
Real quick, what if you do get both? Because you guys are a CPRIT awardee for $20 million, but you still just raised $100 million, right? So the CPRIT money came first, but CPRIT's a pain sometimes to continue on. We love CPRIT, because I know this is
apply for, if you can apply for an SBIR or that kind of, or maybe a secret grant if you're a little further down the road. Now, when the money comes in, it may save your company, And so I'm a big fan of doing it. I think one thing you have to realize is, back to the IP discussion, is that SBIRs are judged by a bunch of your competitors. And so every academic knows that their grants are not really secret. It's not really confidential. I mean, it is from a point of view, you can still patent it, but you know, it might end up on somebody's desk that's working in the same area.
That's the question.
So you gotta be thoughtful about that.
Your secret. I mean, you talk about patents versus trade secret, but you're applying for a grant, but isn't that secret out there now?
Well, I think secret probably has better mechanisms for keeping everything confidential, and they probably, my guess is they put all the reviewers under sort of deep confidentiality agreement. But academics are a little bit different. I mean, I've actually had an academic come back and say, "Oh, I just reviewed this. It's competitive to us," and hand me the grant proposal. And I thought, well, just don't give me that. But I'm not trying to turn you off of it. I actually think that SBIRs and that sort of thing, you know, that $500,000 could let you do the key experiment that gets you over the hump, because nobody will fund you because you need to do a human, you know, a non-human primate experiment, or you need to do something that's kind of out of your budget, and it's not the kind of thing that investors really want to pay for. No investors want to pay for a safety, you know, sort of a tox study kind of thing. They want to, it's just not very appealing. And if you can't, it can save your company. So I'm a pretty big fan of actually just doing that and getting going. If you can write it in such a way that you're not really worried about the IP situation.
And investors are not really concerned about that in a sense, in terms of, because you have, you know, they say they're concerned about publications not having the kind of the IP before the publication. But then,
well, I don't want to get into the weeds, but my personal view is it doesn't act as prior art unless a description is published, and the description is enough to tell people exactly enough about what you're doing. But the application itself is considered confidential. But the truth is, if you need more time, if you're a little worried about somebody picking up on a new target that you're working on you've not published, you have to sort of weigh that. Again, maybe you still need to do it, because getting that $250,000 or $500,000 is going to be, you don't know, but it might save your company. So.
All right.
Anything to add?
It's a good discussion though. It's a good point about the prior art, and I guess, Dan, to expand it, it's legal prior art or legal IP issues versus just like NDAs and how much they're worth sometimes in a highly competitive space.
And look, you can be a little too paranoid about IP and not talk to anybody and never get anything done.
Yeah.
So it's just something to be thoughtful about, and you know, do your filing before you do your grant proposal. That sort of thing might be a good idea in some cases.
Garage startups sound a lot better on paper than they work in reality most of the time. So one of the things I wanted to think about, sort of, we have a few more minutes. There was a point earlier I wanted to wrap back around to, which was, because again, I know it seems redundant, I think, when you're sitting up here, because I think at some point you just sort of accept this, but what I want to talk about is, like, what's the importance of, I'm actually going to hit, you can choose either aspect, either balancing the cap table or the dangers of having the wrong person in a leadership role, like how that can impact fundraising capabilities, how that becomes a, you know, it's not the technology or maybe even the team, but, you know, cap table. And I bring up the cap table specifically because I know JR has a good story around it, but I think there's flavors of that you all should feel able to expand on.
Yeah, so the stories aren't to like scare folks, but like there's so many, you know, nightmares on Cap Street that we see with a lot of startups that come in that we get to work with. And I think Dan made the point before, it's about like just being thoughtful and thinking through how you're using your equity. And what you don't want to do is create a mess of outsized equity that doesn't align to the future, or over rewards early participation for ultimately what the company needs to be and how you use your equity as a tool. So, you know, I think that's something that, you know, we could be helpful with, you know, advisors and, your attorneys around the table could help with. But I think it's creating the right frameworks to know how to use your equity and how to use those different awards, and then also for folks to see what the value is in that equity. Dan talked about vesting before too, and that becomes an important piece to make sure that you've got the right mechanisms and controls in place so that you are aligned in how you're using your equity. But there's been a lot of different deals that we've seen that we've ultimately couldn't fund because the cap tables were just, they weren't aligned, and there wasn't then an interest to, you know, revisit them by previous investors. And we see a bunch of that happen when there's a lot of earlier, larger family office money that comes into deals, and there's a misalignment, or you get into very technical term here, funky terms that start to like just make larger surgery needed to get the cap table better aligned. Anything you'd add, Dan?
Well, I would say we, as investors, spend a lot of time trying to think about what the right cap table is for the company going forward and do surgery on it if necessary, if possible. But sometimes the patient is terminal.
Yeah.
And it's not about it's about being fair and everybody being motivated, and when you're starting up, you don't really know exactly. You don't know how things are going to turn out, and sometimes they don't turn out exactly right. But you can, we try to put our thumb on it and push it in the right direction. I think if you tell me you're building a drug company, and that's not everybody here, but you're building a drug company, it's gonna be worth $1 billion or multi-billion dollars. You should be okay with, at the end, if you as a founder, you have a couple of % of it, it changes your life, and you got paid the whole time. So one caution is, you don't want to spray it around and end up with too unnecessary dilution, but you can be overly dilution sensitive, and so if you get the right group or team, one of the options we don't ever talk about here is, this is all about sort of bootstrapping your own company. I've seen 2 situations in the last year and a half where teams have found a company or found a startup, really good teams, and negotiated and pulled the founder along and created a company around the founder, and had a very significant portion of ownership, like 80%, 60, 80% of the ownership, and the founder's going to do great in those situations. So it's just don't get yourself in a situation that you can't get out of, where you have the wrong people and the wrong cap table. That's the problem. I mean, there's a lot of different ways what I'm saying is, there's a lot of different ways it could work out really well, but there's some ways that it could not.
Yeah, I mean, we're going through a deal, right? We're going through a deal right now where, from when the company was started, there were 3 people who had like equal participation, and with the view that none of them were going to go full time, and they were ultimately going to build a team, and then someone jumps in. And I think it's about like trying to have thoughtful conversations on the way in, and then using like just different points to say, and it's not weekly and it's not monthly, but start to look like, hey, is this still right? Is this still right, especially if we want to start adding or bringing in other partners? Because we spend a lot of time talking about that. The cap table probably takes a lot of time early on just to make sure it's aligned and we're giving ourselves flexibility. But I think alignment is really the term that we think about the most from that. But you don't know what you don't know, and you're going through this journey to figure that out.
Yeah, I think
That's on. Yeah. Or another battery died maybe.
Yeah, there are more batteries on the table.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what's been said. I mean, I think just being thoughtful, and it's hard, I think, starting out to really kind of plan, how much of the cap table do you need to set aside for employees, and you don't have to have it all set aside at once. You can re-up kind of the option pool at various points in time. But I just think making sure that's aligned with the team that you need to bring on board. And I think the other element of your question, Sarah, was what about the bringing in the wrong person, and how does that?
Yeah.
impact.
Have you seen that play out? What was your experiences with it? Someday I'll figure out how to put batteries in this.
Yeah, I mean, it can be extremely detrimental if the interests of the initial founders are not aligned, and they're not on the same page. So I think that's a really important conversation to have at the outset, is what are your goals here? What
is kind of your philosophy for building this company? Because if you have one individual there that is not on the same page as everyone else, you know, one bad apple really can spoil the bunch. And I think without the right protections in place, that person can still hold a stake in the company, and that can be a real problem going forward. So I think it's just very critical that anyone who is kind of sitting down and agreeing to embark on this really big thing together has some really in-depth conversations about what they want to achieve and how they want to do it, because those are both important. You may want the same things, but if you want to go about it in very different ways and one side's not willing to budge, that can create real issues and real friction.
You know, the thing I would add is like, this part becomes just it's so much less algorithmic, and you have to, it really becomes about how you manage and communicate with people. And that's an ongoing thing, because these things become highly emotional about what folks believe is right or believe is fair. And without like just like an ongoing dialogue to understand what those things are and how things are changing, you know, that's where I think you get into these like larger battles, you know, when it becomes highly emotional from that basis. But this is something that happens, I'd say more often than not, you know, as far as like just revisiting, you know, how equity gets divvied up and ultimately, you know, what's fair, you know, and I think folks assign different values on that based on their biases.
So, I mean, I feel that right now we are talking about something that you already have something, you have the company, you have the founder already, and you want to build a team. But I have a question, like one step back. Let's say for most of the PI here, I would think that we have the idea, we have progress on some technology, but we need to have a jump start. So how to do that? Like we just need to have a start a shell company with just a name, and then apply SBIR, STTR, or C-Trade, and then once we get the money, and then we start build a team, or we start from somewhere else.
So I think the question is kind of what's the first step for
the very first step.
The very first step.
the very first
When we
step.
only have
Well, I think because that's a somewhat open-ended question. Well, I just want to say I think that's a somewhat open-ended question because I think people have different strategies, and but I do think it's a good philosophical question to leave off with if everybody has like a thought of, you know, you're a PI or you're advising a PI. You know, what do you look for first? What's the first step? Where do you go?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's kind of the tactical way to go about this. You know, what do you do in terms of establishing a company and incorporating it and you know, getting the license? So those are all steps that need to be completed. But I think
let's
there's
assume that we got all of the IP, we got all of the intellectual property provision.
You've already done a bunch of steps then.
Then you know, that was going to be kind of my other side of this. I mean, I think it's to really sit down and think about the plan and what you want to achieve and what you want to accomplish, and think very hard about that. You have a technology, you have all of the paperwork in place, so that seems like okay, I've got what I need. But do you? Because I think that's where you need to understand your motivation and where you want to go to be able to have kind of the conversations that JR is talking about with others, and to really clearly communicate your vision and bring other people on board. So I think it's really kind of sitting down, and I mean, I hesitate to call it a business plan, but I think it's more kind of like your plan for where you want to take the company, your vision for what you want this to be, and make sure that you're really, really clear on that. And it's gonna evolve, it's probably gonna change, you know, to Tom's point earlier though, but if you don't start, you're never gonna be able to move forward. So, you know, don't spend an eternity building this out, but I think that requires a lot of deep thought in terms of what you want to achieve and where you want to take this.
I'll just add a quick complimentary point. With less experience on the biotech side, I think like a really helpful exercise, always work backwards. Working backwards will help you think about your resource planning. It'll help you think about what are the things that you need. It'll help you like start to like create the right conversations to work backwards to get there. So the more you do that, like the more you look at everything from like today to tomorrow, it's a little less obvious to see, well, how are you gonna need something or what needs to be done? The more, you know, if you could free up the time, you know, it seems like one of the opportunities through this program to work backwards of how you get there. It's probably gonna create the right frameworks to give yourself, you know, a point of view in how you get there.
I think saying that a little bit differently, we think of companies almost in terms of milestones. How do you increase the value by hitting something that usually is a de-risking milestone or proof of that somebody cares about what you've done, or maybe a technical, how we're better than anybody else. Could be technical, could be a business milestone, but what are the milestones that move the needle and allow you to raise capital, to recruit people, get help? If you need to form a company in order to hit those milestones, you say you know that you need money that isn't available in the university, you need an SBIR or STTR, you need a company for that. That's a reason to form a company. It's not a reason to hire a CFO and all. Frankly, there's almost no company, you won't need a CFO for a long time, so hiring a CFO is like not worthwhile. But getting a little legal help to form a company doesn't cost very much, especially if it's one person. If you start issuing stock, okay, maybe it's $5,000 or $10,000 out of your pocket to do that. If you need to do that to get the money to hit the milestone, then have at it. I don't see a real downside. If you're going to do it and then you're going to take $100,000, you don't know what you're going to do with it, and it's going to spend it and make the investors kind of unhappy because they didn't understand how long it was going to take you, and that $100,000 isn't even enough to, you know, for a mature company, it doesn't even pay for a week's worth of burn rate. You might just hold off if you can continue to hit those milestones in the university environment. So I think stepping back and thinking, to JR's point, sort of maybe backwards of how you get there, but at least what are the next couple of milestones that you need to hit, and what resources do you need to do that? And that should tell you whether forming a company is necessary. And one of them might be, we need to get their IP done, like I said, before we talk to people. And the university's not gonna do a good job, so I need to raise some money or put some of my own funds in to do it. Could be, but maybe not. Maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe you can continue to think about it in your lab, talk to people here, and you don't have to form a company, and you don't have to have that kind of overhead of having done it. Not answering your question, but those are the things I think about. Is what's the next couple of milestones?
That's a good leading off.
Yeah, and remember this part too. Like, this is always like an undervalued piece of like I think how founders, or at least early first time founders or early stage founders think about things is you're always recruiting. You're always recruiting people into what you're doing, and you're going to spend a bunch of time on that for the work that has to be done, but also like we talked about before, communicating, visiting with folks, getting people interested, and that becomes a great opportunity to keep refining how you're telling the story of what you're doing in the future.
It's been a good discussion. I'm gonna add Kate, since I have the mic and I get to do it, I'm gonna do it just real quick. Because it's the one thing I think wasn't quite said is all of this is the assumption that you've decided to start. And the one mistake I see people make, I think right now you're in information gathering mode, trying to figure out, a lot of you, should you start? But at some point you gotta say, what do I want? Should I start? And if I'm going to start, I'm gonna start. And I think that's a critical step I think is overlooked sometimes. Okay, there's lunch out there.
probably rapidly disappearing, so we should go look at it.
I will send you an email